Welcome to the sixth lecture of the ACT Spring 2015 lecture series towards civic art. I'm Gediminas Urbonas, director of the program in art, culture, and technology. I lost art somewhere. I hope to find it tonight. In 2005, when Monday night lecture series was launched, it aimed to bring together artists, cultural practitioners, and scientists from different disciplines to discuss artistic methodologies and forms of inquiry at the intersection of art, architecture, science, and technology. Over the last 10 years, we have developed series expanding our scope, continuing to invite the critical thinkers and cultural producers of our time to come together to address current issues and contemporary challenges. Continuing on with this tradition, our Spring 2015 Spring lecture series toward civic art investigates the critical spatial practices that claim manifold definitions of public art through a diverse array of visual forms argued by key practitioners across the disciplines of art, pedagogy, architecture, and urban studies to identify the tools, tactics, and consequences of actively reclaiming public space. The title Towards Civic Art is borrowed from the Georgi Kepes text published in 1972 and alludes to the artists and cultural producers grappling with complex systems when addressing environmental crises as well as crises in politics and democracy. Kepes wrote, "Today artists like the rest of us face a profound crisis brought about by the increasingly dynamic complexity of our social fabric. Meeting its challenge requires their fundamental reorientation in order to probe, scan, discover, absorb, change, and re-edify their surroundings. They must transform themselves as well as the social framework of the creative process. This imperative refers not only to the exploration of the new tools and media, but also to the exploration of new ways in which the work of art and the public can come together. The urgent issues Kepes saw emerging in the 60s and 70s still persist today. Kepes' vision of artists and cultural producers responding to relevant contemporary issues on a civic scale is fundamental to the practices of the speakers who have been invited to participate in this series." It's true. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing Claire Pentecost. Pentecost work engages collaboration, research, teaching, writing, lecturing, drawing, installation, and photography in an ongoing interrogation of the institutional structures that organize knowledge. Her projects often address the contested boundary between the natural and the artificial, focusing in recent years on food, agriculture, and bioengineering. Pentecost has collaborated with the late Beatriz daCosta and the Critical Art Ensemble. Since 2006, she has worked with Brian Holmes, 16 Beaver, and many others, organizing a series of seminars to articulate the interlocking scales of our existence in the logic of globalization. Pentecost collaborates with the Midwest Compass Group, a collective exploring their ties to different neighborhoods, cities, and rural areas around the Midwest Radical Culture Corridor, known as MRCC. A project of spatial and cultural awareness of inhabiting, transversing, and narrating, Compass recently initiated a series of public hearings on the activities of the Monsanto Corporation. Recently, Pentecost has exhibited at dOCUMENTA 13, Whitechapel Gallery, and the 13th Istanbul Biennial. She is represented by High Pictures New York and is professor and chair of the Department of Photography at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Claire Pentecost.
Thank you, Gediminas. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everyone who has made my visit delightful. I think today you just have to be curious about a place like MIT. because it is at such an interesting juncture of things that are in flux in our society. So thanks for inviting me to the great MIT. Okay, let me get my right view. And I mean that. I really do. Okay, I want to start with this quote by John Cage, the mid-20th century composer. And it was in an interview, and he was talking about someone had asked him about what they were doing when they started doing chance operations. And he says, it wasn't a question of communication or something to be understood, but it was a question of changing our minds about the fact of being alive. Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah, it sounds really loud to me. So the first few times I read this quote, it would make tears come to my eyes. And I couldn't explain that, but I will say that a lot of my work is, I feel like there's something fundamental about asking myself, what does it mean to be alive in this time and place, and how does that feel? How do I feel about it? So a few years ago, one of the thinkers I really love from the 20th century is Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist. And in a lecture he gave in 1968 called Epistemologies of Pathology, he said this, and this is published in his book, Steps to an Ecology of Mind. Darwin proposed a theory of natural selection and evolution in which the unit of survival was either the family line or the species or subspecies or something of the sort. But today it is quite obvious that this is not the unit of survival in the real biological world. The unit of survival is organism plus environment. And that's my emphasis. We are learning by bitter experience that the organism which destroys its environment destroys itself. So this is something that has kind of directed some of my research. So I think about plants a lot. So this is too general a question, but let me make it specific for you. If you would, for just a minute, think of a plant that you know and maybe that you're attached to, maybe you just notice it on a regular basis in your routine. Just get a thought of a plant in your mind. Okay, so where is it? Anybody?
Desert, at my house.
In the house?
Yeah.
Okay, where else?
In a pastoral field.
In a field, pastoral field.
Cracks of the sidewalk.
Cracks of the sidewalk, exactly. Okay, so did anybody think about the part of the plant that's underground? Just curious, you know, in your vision of the plant.
A mushroom.
Mushroom is a fungus. I didn't make it up. Okay, anyway, what is the environment of a plant? Standard ecological answer, it depends. Depends on a lot of different things. But what I want to talk about is that part of the plant that lives underground, right? This whole cosmos that we never think about unless you happen to be thinking about it, which is not likely. So hydroponics and aeroponics notwithstanding, most plants live in the soil. And I had researched for many years industrial agriculture, and then I was researching alternative methods, and the key element in alternative production of food is the soil, the condition of the soil. And so what is soil? There are lots of definitions of it, but the simple one is that it's a mixture of sand, silt, and clay, which are particle sizes. inhabited by a complex of interdependent life forms. So in this diagram, you're seeing the particles of different sizes, but then there are all these classes of organisms like fungal hyphae and spores, by which we know mushrooms, amoeba, ciliate, flagellates, nematodes, bacteria, tons of bacteria, mycorrhizal hyphae, and decomposing plant cells, and the root, which is that little arc there. Now, you'll notice about it, I just want to point out that there is room between all these things. And that's what we call soil structure. And it's very important because all these living organisms need oxygen and water. I mean, there are organisms that can live in your soil if it goes anaerobic, if you don't have oxygen, because it's so compacted. But they're mostly pathogens. So you want the aerobic creatures. Okay, that's my title, The Quick and the Dirty, based on The Quick and the Dead. And I was just making a joke about it because I think people think of soil often as dead. I mean, it may be changing. Maybe a lot of people are starting to become aware of soil. So The Quick and the Dirty. And there's an example of a soil workshop out of control. Okay, this is my soil biology teacher, Elaine Ingham. She's really awesome. And this diagram that, I didn't make this, but this is called the soil food web, and you can find lots of diagrams of it. She taught me to look at soil samples under the microscope, and these are pictures I've taken through my microscope. And one thing I want to point out, all this amber clumps, that's bacteria clumping together. They exude a kind of glue and stick to each other, and so they make microaggregates, and so they improve the soil structure. Like, I always thought the soil structure just had to do with particle size, but it's actually the biology. And they also store nutrients, and they store nitrogen, and because they're glued together, the nitrogen doesn't wash out of the soil and into the rivers where it creates dead zones, because we put way too much nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen, on our plants. So that's a microarthropod. This is mycorrhizal hyphae, and these communicate between plant roots. They live in symbiotic relationship to plant roots. They provide nutrients, water, and different elements to the plant as the plant demands, and the plant gives them sugars and starches. Here's another microarthropod, and see, it's moving. It's two different pictures, but see its little arms? Wait. The computer's, okay, well, anyway. And this is one of the cool things about this system of learning about soil biology is when you look, wait a minute. Oh, sorry, the computer's just really unhappy. Okay, when you look at your soil sample, it's still alive. So you see all these things moving, and you can learn to determine the health of your soil by the kinds of organisms in it. This is a protozoa, probably a stalked ciliate. This is, I have no idea what. It's like the blastula or the solar anus, or, and this thing down here that looks like a piece of a rhino or something. I don't know what it is, but there's a lot of cool stuff in there. That's my point. And this is a tardigrade, which is also called a water bear. Some of you may have heard of, I don't know why, but they seem to be something people know a lot about. This is a nematode that I videotaped. It's like a little teeny kind of worm or snake, but it's feeding on bacteria. And what it excretes is in a very good form for the plants to absorb. And this is also the weird depth of field of a microscope. You're seeing that here too. What else did I want? Okay, so a lot of this in the soil food web is about who eats whom or what, and who is metabolizing who else. And so these trophic levels, those are levels of who's eating who. And then their ejecta is nutrients for somebody. So this is a system that recycles its own waste and harvests energy from a star, right? It's an amazing system. And that's just like very, very, very simplistic what I just told you. Anything else here? Well, so you see these things and the arrows indicate who's eating who. And then, of course, you have to remember that all of this, no matter how high the trophic level or predators you get, in the end, it's going to be organic matter so that the macrophages, bacteria, and fungi are going to eat you. So what's the environment of a plant cultivated for food? Well, most commonly, it's industrial agriculture. These are some pictures I took at a farming agricultural trade fair in Argentina, because I've done a lot of research in Argentina because it's a very particular case study of what happens when the industrial system is imported. It's basically the American system, and it's being exported to a lot of other places in the world. So this is a machine that can spray pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and fertilizer, and it's fossil fuel intensive. You also see part of this environment is chemical companies, and many of the major ones are also seed companies, and they make the inputs, the biocides, and the synthetic fertilizer, all of which are the processes are very fossil fuel intensive. And then you have tanks for carrying your chemicals behind your truck that has all these tubes. And at the trade fair, you see lots of trucks and tires. So these are the keys to the agricultural system that we generally depend on. And you see banks. Because you can't, this is capital intensive farming, right? You can't do it without credit. You can't buy all that fancy machinery. And they're like satellite driven, right? And they have remote sensors. I mean, I'm sure there are people in this room who know about this technology because this is a place where a lot of people are doing stuff with sensors. And I saw the city farm upstairs in the Media Lab building. And then what do you get? Monoculture. And in Argentina, the big soy boom, I mean, it's the kind of like strongest piece of their economy, is soy, and it's all genetically modified, which means that it's modified, it's transgenic, it's engineered to resist the herbicide, glyphosate, made by the same company, which is Monsanto. So in this system, you have lots of externalities. You have a destruction of the soil system that I was giving you just a little taste of. You have peasant evictions because you have larger farms, because the small farms can't survive in this atmosphere. You have actual birth defects and in humans and other animals, and you have social unrest. So this is kind of what I just said. So I call this the debt, chemical, petroleum, intellectual property, industrial monoculture system. And it's really interesting because it also depends on financialization, which we are seeing throughout economies under neoliberal conversion systems. Where does all that soy go? Most of it's exported. The Argentinians are not really a soy-eating culture. And And a lot of it is processed and winds up in, the American food system and other, food systems of its kind, in which you have all this undifferentiated commodity stuff like corn, soy, and canola, and you have to make it into something appetizing, right? So they make all these little novel forms and load it with sugar and salt and fat, and to make it appetizing. And then you can add some vitamins back that you either bred out of the cultivar you're using or whatever. Now, I'm interested in soil and how do you make and sustain healthy soil? Because actually, when you have healthy soil, those systems that I was talking to you about, they protect the plants from weeds and pests. Compost. Compost is really key because you're just mimicking the biocycle of kind of making sure you aerate a decomposition process. This is a piece in which I composted with worms, vermicomposting, for 4 months, my kitchen scraps, in a bed that was 5 feet by 9 feet, and it held an American flag that was cotton. And so I composted the flag, and I called it Proposal for a New American Agriculture. And one of the things that interests me is about materializing the sign, the thing that is abstract. I mean, a flag is a physical thing, but it also has this really powerful symbolic content, right? And I'm really interested in what happens when you pass those things through a material process. Anyway, the externalities were the compost for my garden. So I started thinking about value and what's considered valuable in our culture. Which I think is very much the province of artists, because when you put something in the space called art, you are putting it in a social discursive space where values are debated. And so, you may have, like, some people 10 years ago started gardening and calling it art. And, people were throwing up their hands and saying, people have always gardened. Why is this art now? And I think it was a move among many people to take that activity, that class of human activity of producing food, and put it in the space where we discuss values. So this is a quote by Bifo, which is the kind of popular name of Franco Berardi, an Italian philosopher. And he says, capitalism is the application of human skills as a means to obtain a more abstract goal, the accumulation of value. And here we go with another sign system, right, which is money. And money is the general equivalent, right? So it's a notion of value abstracted to a sign that can then reflect any other value. So, $4 equals 3 pounds of potatoes, 40,000, 3 acres of farmland, these equivalences, right? And I'm really interested in the way that our economy turns things into signs. It's kind of like with the food system in an informationalism where you say, okay, these are the vitamins that we need. So we can abstract those, we can process the original food stuff, and then add them back. And we can these are mobile. It's mobile like money. They're mobile values. It's designed to circulate. So you can make equivalences. And here is another example of a money designed to circulate. And that's very much a sign system too. Sneakerheads. So a lot of this has been associated with gold, which, as we know, has to be an abstract value because what exactly can you do with gold? Well, maybe here the engineers know a lot of things you can do with gold. And I congratulate you because it's often put in these forms. And I was just looking at this woodcut from 1594 of the American natives pouring molten gold into a colonist's mouth because they thought they are so gold crazy, they must need it to survive. Let's see what happens when we feed them gold. Okay, so anyway, maybe some of you remember the gold standard, and that's when many countries, I'm gonna have to read this because I get it confused sometimes, fixed their exchange rates relative to the US dollar, and central banks could exchange dollar holdings into gold at the official exchange rate of $35 per ounce. Because, you know, they thought like, well, money, you know, I mean, the value of it can fluctuate too much. So let's pin it to something that's concrete. So once again, a kind of materialization of signs. So all currencies pegged to the dollar had a fixed value in terms of gold. Remember this guy? So what happened to the gold standard? In the administration of Charles de Gaulle, the president of France from 59 to 69, France, that saucy little France, decided they would start cashing in their dollars for gold at the official rate. And this reduced the US economic influence because you know, the whole point was that you don't trade your dollars in for the gold, you keep it moving. And then the US, you keep the dollar strong, right? So France doing this, plus the financial strain of the Vietnam War, led Richard Nixon to end the international convertibility of the dollar to gold in 1971, the Nixon shock. It was meant to be temporary, but it seems that people in the financial industry found there were a lot of ways you can make money off money if you keep it on a fiat system. Okay, so not pinned to anything material, except petroleum de facto is the sort of main commodity that determines the value of everything else. The value of petroleum, and this is the Deepwater Horizon, BP's. And so, can't remember his name right now. Soon after we went off the gold standard, there was an economist that coined the term petrodollars. And you know, for a really long time, because of our deals, our agreements with OPEC, every country had to buy petroleum from OPEC in dollars. So they had to keep dollars on hand, again, strengthening the US economy. Of course, Saddam Hussein started selling petroleum for euros, and look what happened to him. So I was thinking about these petrodollars and about what a crisis we're in because of the centrality of petroleum to everything we do. In fact, wait, I don't want you to read that yet. One of my friends who's a desk and drum, who's like writing a performance studies PhD on the performance of petroleum, he says, well, he was working with some Native Canadians on the pipeline barricades, and they would say things like, I am the mountains, I am the river, I am the whales, I am the eagle. And he was thinking, well, what am I? I am petroleum. That is what is the most key thing in my environment that supports my life. So I was thinking, what happens if I take this quote, what if we applied human skills as a means to obtain many various concrete goals, for instance, food security? What if the accumulation of value was not measured in an abstraction like money, but instead measured according to the health of the earth and the people who live on it? So I'm wondering, can you embed the question of what is valuable in the sign itself? So I decided to propose an economy based on soil, that soil would be the referent of value. And, you know, when you're a research-driven artist, there always comes a moment, which is the question of form. Because I'm interested in art, believe it or not. I haven't really talked much about art yet. And you know, I kind of think part of what makes art art is that it is about a relationship of the form to the rest of whatever is being offered by the artist. And so you can use a form that's traditionally designated as art, like a painting, or you can borrow forms, innovate forms, recombine forms. So I wanted to work with soil, and here's one of my precedents, Newton Harrison of Newton and Helen Harrison, Making Earth in 1970. And they made their earth with sand, silt, and clay, and manure, and some organic material. And they mostly made piles of it. Then there's Walter D. Maria's New York Earth Room, a permanent installation at the Dia Foundation in Manhattan. But I wanted to connote money. So I started researching forms for currencies, and the disc goes way back. Many cultures have used the coin shape. And then also the ingot, which is used to store precious metals before, like the form before the form, right? And so I decided to make ingots of soil. And this was my project called Soil Erg. Soil Erg is what I named this denomination of money. And it's made of soil and work. And therefore the erg, which is the Greek root for work, and as I'm sure a lot of you know, it's a measurement. It's an increment in physics, a unit of work. So I was going to do this project for the dOCUMENTA 13 in 2012. And one of the great things about the dOCUMENTA is that you're invited early and you get a lot of resources. And if you do your project in Germany, everybody wants to help you because they're very proud of the dOCUMENTA and they love it. So I found out that the University of Kassel, because the document is held in Kassel every 5 years, has the only fully organic research academic program in agriculture. Like in other programs, organic is like a section of it. But at the University of Kassel, it is everything. It's undergraduate through PhD. And so they're really dedicated to ecological forms of agriculture. So they have a campus outside of Kassel in a little town called Witzenhausen. And I wrote them about my project, and they were completely enthusiastic. And I organized with them a residency for myself to do this project. And they gave me a studio and use of the greenhouses and technical help and a cement mixer. And I started production of making these soil ergs, actually from compost. And I didn't want to use anything that was not compostable, nothing toxic to hold them together. So I had to do a lot of experiments in how this would work. And one of the things I wound up using was potato starch glue. But it took a long time to make each one involved. And here is a display of them. I also decided that I would display them on a panel of gold. So that's a piece of glass that I gold leafed. And, you know, a lot of different kinds of people come to the Documenta. This Documenta was about 900,000 people, and I wanted it to be accessible. I wanted people to get it. And I think when people saw the ingot shape and the gold, they got it, but it was reversed, right? The ground was gold and the ingots were made of soil. And it had this nice reflective, gold is really beautiful and it's really evil. You know, the whole trend now in philosophy of object-oriented ontology or speculative realism, in which objects are proposed to us to have, objects and materials to have some kind of agency. Well, if this is true, gold has a lot to answer for, right? So I also started making currency notes, designs for them, and but for my pantheon, because, you know, we put important people on the currency notes, I was picking out people from the history of organic agriculture and people who have advanced our understanding of a non-industrial, non-toxic way of producing food. This is Jerome Irving Rodale, a pioneer of American organic agriculture. And then I submerged the drawings in a soil-water mix and made these patterns because, once again, I wanted this kind of materiality. And then I made a stamp with the soil erg currency, and I made 43 of these drawings. This is Lady Eve Balfour, who started the Soil Association in Britain. This is George Washington Carver, who was a childhood hero of mine and did like 600 things with the peanut. Lynn Margulis, who's a biologist who died in 2012, and she's so amazing. She took the ideas of symbiogenesis from two Russian, a lichenist, Mereshkovsky, and a botanist, Kozo Polyansky, and developed this idea. And it was an idea of, like, how did the eukaryotic cell emerge? It's like the question of morphogenesis, like, how do new forms arise in the course of evolution? And she was a Darwinist, but not a neo-Darwinist, meaning that she did not emphasize the competition part, but much more the symbiotic relations. And she said new organisms, like, for instance, a bacteria swallows another bacteria, but the one that's been eaten doesn't die and continues to function inside the body of the other. And so it becomes, over time, a nucleus or mitochondria, organelles. So interesting. And then I put some activists in. This is Vandana Shiva. And then I started putting in, it started to get kind of idiosyncratic, like these are kind of my teachers, right? This is Thoreau. And so I started to include people who are philosophers or writers who have kind of contributed to our sense of the human as part of a larger system. Here's Kafka, who wrote bizarre stories about animals. Donna Haraway and her companion, Cayenne. A mole. Oh, yeah, so then I started including the creatures in the soil food web. So here we have a mole, a bee, and this is a water bear. See, remember I told you that? But this is what it looks like with an electron scanning microscope. Earthworm, of course. And there are these other things that sort of form the kind of imagist texture of it. Here, that diagram is Darwin's first diagram about evolution. When he first had this idea, that crazy little diagram there. And his last book was on the earthworm. It's really fantastic. And that is from a sketch in Emma Darwin's daybook, which she was probably making for a child. And I just wanted to invoke the whole like Darwin household. And then while I was doing this, I found this quote from the investment guru Warren Buffett, and he said, "I will guarantee you that farmland over 100 years is going to beat gold as an investment," right? And lo and behold, there is a rush, a global rush on farmland. And investment funds, hedge funds, retirement funds, and governments are buying up farmland all over the world. A lot in Africa, a lot in South America, Australia. And it's not just northern countries buying from the South. It's a kind of neocolonialism, but it's not as predictable in terms of who the players are. But for instance, TIAA-CREF, is that the retirement fund for MIT? No, okay, well, it's for a lot of colleges and universities. They're investing in farm. And what's happening is the people who live on that land and have been farming it for generations and often don't have any kind of title or deed are kicked off the land because their governments are kind of selling it out from under them. And so refugee populations are produced, and what is being grown there, mostly food for export, cash crops, or feed for animals. Okay, so in a couple of ways, I wanted the project to extend beyond the gallery, and I collaborated with this fellow on the left named Ben Fratton, who I met in my soil science class, and he and his friend Randy Coleman here have a foundation called Can You Love, where they're designing vertical growing systems for people who don't have land, right? Because I figured out I needed to distinguish soil from real estate, because soil, anybody can make soil, but if you want to grow food with it, you have to have a place. So these are very simple, very cheap vertical growing systems. They're about 6 feet tall and 3 feet around. And this is in the beginning of the growing season where lots of food crops have been planted there. And this is the same shot 6 weeks later. And that's all food plants. So I wanted to include 3 of these in my project, and the university got excited about these and wrote a grant from the German government so that we could make 10 more and do experiments, and we put them around Kassel, and we did different experiments about like the substrate and the watering system, et cetera. That's later in the system. Ours were really crazy because one was just legumes because they fix nitrogen in the soil. And one was for the cows and bees. So it was like pollinator plants and meadow plants. And so I was really lucky enough in the dOCUMENTA to have this lovely room in the Museum of Natural History, which opened out onto this garden where it could continue with my our growing systems. One more element I'll tell you about. In the back, you see these two cabinets. One has a set of earphones next to it. Well, the one on the left is this very curious object that was in the collection of the Museum of Natural History. It's from around 1790 something. And it's called the Reichelsdorfer Mountain Cabinet. And what you see in the top compartment are stones that were cut from the mountain, and they're put in the proportion of the geological layers of the surface of the earth. And so it's one of those, 18th century kind of like educational objects. And then I found out the reason they had cut into the mountain was because they were mining. And that dark band at the bottom was the copper ore. So I borrowed it to put it in my installation to represent an age of extraction, of treating the earth as something, the surface of the earth is something you take things from. And I'll just say that I consider industrial agriculture an industry of extraction. And then I had a copy made. And that's the one on the right. And in my copy, there was a worm bin with a glass panel. So, and these are some students feeding the worms. And you could see there, but you can't see them because they don't like light. So we recorded them eating, and you could listen. See, that woman has earphones on. So you could hear them kind of like, anyway, one more thing. You see that on the original, there's writing on the inside of the covers. Well, so I put writing on mine, and these were charts of land-grabbing deals that would include like the country where it happened, the entity buying, the amount of acres, and then what was planned to. And then I did soil biology workshops where I hooked up the microscope to the video, and we had a farmers' compost congress where all these organic farmers brought samples, and they smelled them and tasted them and rated them, and then they put the ratings up and had a big discussion. This is my friend Jürgen Hess, who helped me so much. And they even made a compost manifesto. Okay, so I'm thinking about bacteria and biology and the soil biology, right? Like these microorganisms. And I learned that, maybe you know this, there are 100 times more genes in and on my body that belong to bacteria than belong to me, the human, right? And just like in agriculture, we have this attitude towards them. So here's a Purell ad that I couldn't resist saving. And it's so interesting because imagine a touchable world. Well, what keeps the world from being touchable? It's germs. You can't touch anything because there might be germs. So Purell will have you running through a field with kerchiefs on, like peasants. Anyway, you may know that the latest turn in medicine in terms of understanding the diseases, the new autoimmune disorders that are popping up like wildfire in affluent countries. They're not in the so-called developing world. The latest idea about it is that it's because we've killed all these bacteria that we evolved with, that are our symbionts. So you see this in the press a lot. Here, New Yorker is saying, germs are us. Here's the Smithsonian, microbes, the trillions of creatures governing your health. I can't read this. Childhood microbial experience, immunoregulation, inflammation, and adult susceptibility to psychosocial stressors and depression in rich and poor countries. And this author, Graham Rook, one of the three authors, I interviewed in London, and he is so interesting. One of the things he explained to me is that what they've realized is that your gut bacteria teaches your immune system to regulate itself in the developing organism, the child, the human child. And when you don't have it, your immune system doesn't know how to regulate itself. So you get a lot of allergies and other autoimmune disorders. And one of Dr. Rook's ideas is that children need to play in the dirt. And they need to play around animals, and that these things are kind of hold microorganisms that are on a continuum with those in our bodies. And so here we have Michael Pollan in the Times Magazine. Some of my best friends are germs, and you have a child playing in the dirt. So I'm thinking this is my community, or it's the community that I am. This is a self-portrait or a selves portrait. And I made this installation for the Whitechapel Gallery called Old Friends and Unloved Others. Old Friends is the term that Dr. Rook coined for these microorganisms. And unloved others, it refers to all of those species that are not charming, are charismatic, and that no one really sheds a tear when they go extinct. And we have no idea how many are going under the bus in this sixth great extinction. So I made an installation that in the back part was like an apothecary. And I collected mostly pharmaceutical jars and objects that a pharmacy would have had in the past. And in the jars I put dirt. And I got the dirt. You see the labels. Because I got the dirt from very specific places in the area, in London and around London, on the farms, because I wanted to emphasize that soil is very local. Like, the history of that plot of land determines all kinds of things about the condition of that soil and its constitution. So we have all that. And then in the middle of the room was this long table, and in the middle of that was a worm bin, again, with because people get excited about having worms around. And then there were these bell jars. They were also labeled with specific soil, and you could lift the bell jar and take in the aroma of the specific soil. And on this wall were these soil chromatology, in which you use lab-grade filter paper, and first you infuse it with a very dilute silver nitrate solution, and then you let it dry, and you infuse it with a soil sample. And the remarkable thing is that every soil is different. It makes a different picture. So it's like a portrait of the soil. It takes years to learn to interpret them. This was developed by the Waldorf School. Yeah, Rudolf Steiner, thank you. And an associate of his, Aaron Fried Pfeiffer, because they wanted to find a way to get a kind of immediate and a kind of a gestalt image of a soil. On the other side of the room, I had these silver point drawings that I made. And these depict, this is where I let myself go a little crazy, but they depict various unloved others and immune cells and plants and cancer cells and a baby being born, because when the baby goes through the birth canal, that's the first bath of microbes. It doesn't have any in the womb. And so in the successive generations, as with the overuse of antibiotics and biocides, each generation has fewer and less diverse microbiome, because now we're looking at not just your genome, but your microbiome, because everybody is slightly different. Tapeworm, there are people now infecting themselves with tapeworm because it helps their allergies. Isn't that weird? Okay, so, and then I have to tell you about this. So this is the summer of 2013. I'm in London installing this show. Before, a little before I left for London, I got this just excruciating pain in my back, in my lower back. And I never had a back problem. Thank the spirits. And I went to a chiropractor who said, slip disc, pinching the nerve, can't do anything, but here's some exercises. And I also went to a regular doctor, and he said, slip disc, pinch nerve, nothing you can do about it, it'll work itself out, here's some painkillers. And I figured nothing I can do about it, I'll just go ahead and go to London. And it just got worse and worse and moved down my legs. It was my whole pelvis. I could hardly move. I was in a wheelchair at the end of the week. I went to the hospital 3 times that week in London. And finally, I went to St. Mary's, where they were waiting for the prince to be born. And there was press outside every day. So I just happened to go there because I was out of my mind with pain. And the cab driver said, I'll take you to St. Mary's. So turned out I had a staph infection in my spine. So that kind of light area between 4 and 5, lumbar 4 and 5, is damage done to my vertebrae very fast, because staph is super aggressive. And the crazy thing is it lives on our skin, but very rarely does it get past your immune system and into the bloodstream. But when it does, it's really dangerous, and it's very hard to get rid of. So I'm here because of antibiotics, because of a 13-week course of 3 times a day IV antibiotics. And I feel like I have to include this because I'm making a show about beneficial bacteria and the great bacteria that we co-evolved with. And I use this to remind us that actually, you know, sanitation was a huge revolution in medicine, saving lives and preventing disease. And so antibiotics are a miracle, but we really need to use them very, very soberly, right? And not be feeding them to all the animals that we eat. What else did I want to say about this? Oh yeah, I got it in a hospital. That's the major place you can get infected with staph. In a hospital, or if you're an IV drug user, which thank God I wasn't. But because I was being treated for cancer, and with radiation therapy, I had a break in my skin, and a week later, my spine was revolting. So then I did another, so I didn't really get to experience the show, right? I was in the hospital for 2 weeks, and I missed everything. And so I did a different version of it with Chicago soils. And I changed the name to Our Bodies, Our Soils, playing on the feminist health book of the 70s, Our Bodies, Ourselves. And collected soil from, 100+ gardens and farms in and around Chicago and made another environment with the bell jars and everything. And I got to finish. I understand that. Okay. I just wanted to give a little overview of how I think about what I'm doing. And observing other artists that I admired and thinking about the way I would like to position myself, I came up with this term, the public amateur. And it's like a position for an artist. And I'm not saying it's the only position, because I think we need a lot of different kinds of art because we have a very complex society. But in this case, the artist is a learner and learning in public, because in this way, bringing knowledge into the body of the social, right? Because knowledge is very guarded. I mean, it's a contradiction because there's lots of proprietary knowledge now, and schools, universities, and higher education are more and more expensive, even as wealth is extracted from the, expropriated from the bottom 80% towards the top. And so it's a crisis. And I teach in a school, and it disturbs me like every night about like what my students are paying to go to school. So anyway, I also think that it's about connecting knowledge to people's desires and needs, and it's not to replace the specialist, because specialization has accomplished amazing things, but the idea is to connect specializations and also to model something, because on the other hand, knowledge has never been easier to find because of the internet. And, your school puts all the syllabi and course notes up on the internet for free, which is amazing. But I also want to put knowledge in a place where, a socially discursive place where you can also ask, who's producing this knowledge? How is it evaluated? What is it used for? Who does it serve? Who's excluded? How is it affecting our lives way outside the sphere of our own decision-making? And I'm ending now, almost. This is a quote by Edward Said in Representations of the Intellectual, and it's about the amateur. The desire to be moved not by profit or reward, but by love for an unquenchable interest in the larger picture, in making connections across lines and barriers, in refusing to be tied down to a specialty, in caring for ideas and values despite the restrictions of a profession. The intellectual spirit as an amateur can enter and transform the merely professional routine most of us go through into something much more lively and radical. Instead of doing what one is supposed to do, one can ask why one does it, who benefits from it, how can it reconnect with, and I took that out, so that you can decide what you would want to reconnect, your love of knowledge, your desire to understand the world. What do you want to connect that with? And for me, it's partly the fact of being alive, and how do we feel about that? What is it to be alive? And I'll just end with one quick piece called For the Body Without Organs to Sense. So it's The Body Without Organs, of course, Deleuze and Guattari. And then Organs to Sense is a quote from Polanyi talking about in The Great Transformation, talking about how the trading classes in the development of capitalism had no organs to sense what was actually happening to the society and the land and et cetera. So down in South Chicago, there are piles of petroleum coke, which is a byproduct of the coking process for a very crude oil that comes from the Alberta tar sands. And, you know, the Keystone pipeline that we hear a lot about is just one pipeline. But there are several pipelines that come to Chicago. Part of what makes Chicago what it is that it's a node in many transport matrices. So this happens to be owned by the Koch brothers, and they just have piles of this pet coke, and it's a very fine black dust, and it is blowing around, and people are breathing it, and it's a big controversy in my city. But it's also about, you know, like you're not even allowed to burn this in this country. It is so carbon producing, and they sell it to third world countries, right, or so-called third world. So I made this piece, and I used bird cages that I collected for about 3 years. These bird cages were used by miners, and they had canaries in them or other finches, so that when they went in the mines, it was like a displaced organ. Because when the canary fainted, they knew there was a noxious gas, a methane gas or whatever, and they better get out. And I hear this metaphor all the time, right? Partly in relation to either economic crisis or ecological crisis. So I went down here and found a hole in the fence, because it's well guarded, and took a bucket and got some pet coke. And I wanted to make something with it to put in the cages. So I made breasts. I molded it into breasts. Why did I do that? I didn't know. But since I showed this piece, I've had a lot of people tell me why it works. And it's partly, you know, some people say, oh, it's the petroleum tit that we're all sucking. Or, oh, it's that organ of like the rise in breast cancer, of, you know, women getting sick, or, oh, it's that just image of what nurtures life turned to black, turned to a dead thing. So there was one in every cage. And then in one of the cages, there's a live canary. That's my canary. His name is Delirio. And it was really quite lovely to have these bird cages filled with this kind of dark thing. And then to come upon Delirio, and he really does sing his heart out. And I just want to say, because I got a lot of flack, as you can imagine, having a bird in a cage in a gallery. Somebody called the city, and the city inspector came out to see if we were treating this animal inhumanely. And the guy came, and he walks in, he looks in, he says, "It's a canary." Like, of course it's a cage. He said it like 3 times. It's a canary. Like, what's the problem? Anyway, these birds have been bred since the 1400s to sing and to live in cages, which is not to say, you know, he doesn't like to fly, so I let him out, and I bought him a big cage called a flight cage. But I bought him from a breeder. He was a performing canary. He was in song competitions, so he was used to having a public life. So, as you see, I have to say these things in my defense, but also, I felt ambivalent about putting the canary in a cage in a gallery. I mean, he was well loved, like all the students there, because this was at the University of Chicago in their art center gallery, and they took care of him, and the guards would visit him, et cetera. The question is, like, we can take a bird that's very specific form of life in a cage and get really upset. And yet, you know, something like coal mining and pet coke and the tar sands, we can't seem to find the will, the public will, to interrupt. Although I think that's changing. I really think that's changing. So that's my last slide. Thank you.
I have actually a first question. I have quite a few questions, in fact. Thank you for your talk. You started with imagery of bioforms. You with kind of like lessons, that you took in biology, right, class, and I was really kind of like it resonated with some of the images. That fellows, in fact, at the Center for Advanced Visual Studies, here working at MIT, starting from 60s, and then going to 70s, they were retrieving all this scientific imagery from different labs that were captured with a new type of cameras at the time, different type of like high-speed cameras. So in a way, like looking at these forms that were not known yet for humanity, in a way. They were not in the circulation yet, not part of our visual vocabulary or visual experience, and of course these forms inspired new forms, whether they related to production of art or production of new city forms, or production of maybe forms of planning, and
Buildings.
and buildings. Yeah. So I would like to really ask you, like, where do you see certain? No, if we speak about certain trajectory, or if we speak, maybe that's kind of like relates maybe to my other question, question to the form, right? You mentioned, talk borrowed forms, and that was kind of like
Borrowed forms.
Borrowed forms, yeah. So I would like really to ask, like, you didn't say explicitly appropriation, but I really kind of like, I'm really wondering, what did you mean by saying that? Like when we're borrowing some forms coming from either other disciplines or coming like either. So if you could speak about that.
Well, I think I do it in a pretty simple way. I mean, the forms carry meanings, right? And so they can be part of the semiotic formula or combination or soup of an artist, So like, for instance, I took the coin form and the ingot form, which are used, which people have certain associations with, they have a certain function, and I borrowed them, and so that I could bring this meaning in relation to another material to another meaning, to kind of produce some thoughts about that, right? I mean, I'm not really proposing, soil. I mean, that's not something to make into a currency, right? I mean, it's fragile, it's heavy, it's really most valuable where it is, but I'm not really proposing that. I'm just proposing that we think about what underwrites our economy, and how does that inform our daily lives, and what are we trading for that? And what would happen if we had lots of different currencies based on different things that we valued? And what if the currency was actually something you could use? That would be crazy, right? Besides as a general sign of equivalence. So that was a case, right, where I was borrowing a form. I borrowed the actual bird cages that I collect, or the form of the pharmaceutical, the apothecary, right? And so that I could have like this connotation of health, the things we do to address our health problems, and then, you know, bring something else in proximity. It's about this kind of different nearness, right? So that's why I'm, you know, saying like these are borrowed forms. But then, you know, we've had whole phases of art that's all about novelty and form. Paintings that are, you know, shaped and look like your laundry, and, you know. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, I'm.
Or did you mean something else?
Well, this answers part of the question, absolutely. And also, I'm curious, you know, because often when we talk about production of the art form, we're talking also about certain relationships that we want to build with genealogies of art, you know, because art is, in a way, historicizes constantly with the new forms of production itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So. And I wonder, you know, if you could speak about that, you know, how much is that important for you to make these links, you know, with the histories?
Well, I like to make links with histories. I think form is fascinating because everything that humans make has a form. Music has a form. Wine has a form. Food. We're making forms all the time, and the form is integral, right? I mean, it is part of you know, kind of all of our relationship to a given thing is also bound up in our relationship to its form. And certainly, I'm trying to think if, see, so everything has a form. So say you're a research, you're in biomedical research, right? So your research that you publish, there's a form to it, right? There's conventions, like how do you publish it? Conventions of credibility, right? And then you have, and so I could do a lot of research, but I'm not gonna put it in a research paper. And I don't even wanna present it to you in a paper, although I might write an essay, which I have, about a lot of these things. But I don't think you can come up with a form without having some understanding of the forms that inform your project. I mean, that have come before you. Wait, what was I going to say? You were asking me about history of form, right? Links, thank you. I think it's unavoidable, actually. And you know, I remember once, about 20 years ago, I picked up this article by Michael Kimmelman in the New York Times, an art review, and he said, "Finally, art that looks like art." That was the first sentence, you know, and I really thought about that, like, well, is that what we want, you know? And I think about that with because I teach. I work with, you know, artists, and I think a lot of artists, especially when you're very unsure of what you're doing, you want your art to look like art. And I mean, there may be many other reasons, but I personally am kind of interested in art that may not advertise itself immediately as art. I mean, that can be very interesting. And like I said, I think it's a discursive space where we debate values and many other things. So I guess I'm kind of like, I think, in between. You know, I mean, I think that the links to the past are really important, but they don't have to define everything.
Hey, Claire. So I have a question. I'm kind of wondering what you think the boundaries of nature are. Because I witnessed this sort of tendency to put a value judgment on nature and say, nature is natural, it's beautiful, it's harmonious, and the things that man produces and creates aren't. And I kind of am interested in the future of ecosystems in terms of like man-made ecosystems and like the Internet of Things concept. And these sort of innovations follow their own sort of laws and ecosystems that could also be natural. So I'm curious about, you know, where you maybe personally would draw the line of nature, because I struggle a lot with thinking about in terms of value, human value, saying that nature is just de facto wonderful and the things that humans create aren't.
Right, I think that's a great question. And I spent the first 10 years before I got to agriculture, I was asking that question, because whatever we define as natural usually is very tendentious, right? I mean, it produces social controversies often. And I wouldn't draw the line, frankly, because I have looked into the history. For a long time, I did work about institutions and structures of the imagination that mediate our relationship with nature. So, like work about zoos, about the Museum of Natural History, about photography itself, which mediates very much our relationship to what we consider nature, about our romance with native peoples. But this is really interesting to me. I was very much kind of conditioned by a wilderness ideal. And I decided, after researching it for a long time, that wilderness is a fantasy. The wilderness ideal is a fantasy, because for us to make it, for us to have it, we have to maintain it. And we're doing it like there's not agreement on how you govern a so-called wilderness refuge. Do you let there be forest fires, or do you control the fires? All these species evolved to work in a rhythm of fires, right? So that's just one example. I also looked at artists, a whole art literary movement that hated nature. Like, that was really interesting to me. Like Charles Baudelaire, for instance, it's down there with women and the common people. Yeah, right. But, and it changes. It has changed historically. But this is what I was going to tell you. So in 1998, Creative Time invited me to make a proposal about biotechnology, which I was going there anyway, because you have to look at science. If you want to talk about how we mediate and define ourselves and the rest. I don't even know how to call nature now, because it's so in quotes. I call it the nature. And so I started researching the biotechnology, and everything I came across was promissory, you are going to be able to do this, you are going to heal this, you are going to have this kind of baby if you want it, except in agriculture. And we had been eating transgenic agriculture for 4 years, and it hit the headlines that year as a trade issue, because Europe and Japan didn't want our commodities. And this was the force of a revelation to me, agriculture is nature. And that made me realize that these structures of imagination, if you have an idea of nature as something very separate from human activity, then maybe you'll just pour poison into the environment when you're growing food. Because you see, it's separate from us and our health. If we're going to use nerve agents on little beetles, There's no way it's going to affect us because we have categorized nature. So my own misunderstanding, I mean, in fact, I feel like my whole career has been about my misunderstanding of nature and trying to, because I grew up, I love nature. My grandparents had a farm. It was really kind of a play farm. But by the time I was coming up, they had retired. And I liked to go to the woods, and I liked to go to the creek. And I had a lot of fantasies about nature. And I realized, I don't really see it at all. And so I set out on this, and that's really what has driven me, is like how to understand my relationship to this vast otherness that I am a part of, but which I, like a dyed blue carnation, is that nature? Is transgenic agriculture nature? Is a mountain with its head cut off nature? It's like, I don't think we can draw a line anymore. And so I hope you didn't get the impression that I'm one of those people who says nature's all good. I mean, that's partly why I showed you the staph infection passage, because, it's like we take a lot for granted, right? So we can court nature, but mostly I've seen in Western history, we want it on our own terms. We want to reproduce it on our terms so that it doesn't bug us or hurt us or threaten our loved ones. Does that help you at all? Probably not. Yeah, well, it is, and I think you're in a great position to keep this question alive. If you're working on, I don't know how you would even call them, human-made ecosystems, when people do eco-restoration, they have to face these questions, and there's not agreement about it. And I also don't want you to think that I'm against technology. Because sometimes people come out of my lectures, or they'll finally stand up and say, well, you just want us to go back to the cave times, because I criticize biotechnology in agriculture, and because I criticize pouring poisons and fossil fuel intensive methods of producing food when there is this amazing, but I think science, we need science to understand it. I mean, I've been the great beneficiary of scientific knowledge for my own enrichment. I couldn't do any of this without that. So I don't want you to get that impression that I'm one of those nature good, human bad polemicists. Okay.
Okay, yeah, please.
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. Here I am.
Oh, hi.
Hi. And also thank you for bringing some humor to when talking about these very serious issues that affect us all. I'm very curious about your artistic position. You were mentioning the public amateur. Could you please speak a bit more about that? How does this concept of the artist's role being a kind of public learner, as you mentioned, how does it entail the audience? Do you see yourself as someone who is, are you learning? Are you teaching the audience? Are you teaching as well, or is everyone learning? How does this learning process, where is the public, so to say? A lot of the works we've seen today deal with issues that have to do with public space, but then they are presented and kind of from the position of protected space in the gallery. Mm-hmm. So how do you, where do you see public, let's say, happening and learning through your work? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are live questions. Public also is something that is, of course, very hard to define. I think public is also fairly imaginary. In this sense, I just mean that I don't want to model a relationship to knowledge that is about mastery. Like, I don't want to have to present myself as like the master of a particular area, because that's not interesting to me. And I also think that people feel there's a lot of bodies of knowledge that people feel alienated from, and they feel that they need a special kind of authorization to participate in, even though it affects them. And I'm a pretty conventional gallery artist. You know, I'm not breaking any boundaries. This idea of the public amateur, anybody can be that. You don't have to be an artist. It's just anybody who will go beyond the boundaries of what they've been trained for to make connections. And I see it all the time in people who, like for instance, you know, a woman has a baby in a hospital. She does everything she's supposed to do according to the doctors. And then she feels afterwards like an animal, like she was hardly there. And so she starts researching. And in a lot of cases with health, for instance, the burden's on the individual to inform themselves, because the state, you know, like Beck, the Austrian sociologist, what's his first name? Anyway, he writes about secondary modernity and how now we are, like, the secondary modernity is dealing with the problems of the primary modernity. And that he calls it a risk society. So we're mostly defined by our positions in relation to risks, right? And that knowledge is the best kind of route to figuring out how to protect yourself from the risks of a technological, technoscientific culture, society. Ulrich Beck, thank you, B-E-C-K. And, you know, the authorities charged to protect us from these risks are failing us. This seems really clear to me. And that they are also contradicting each other. They're often exposed to be corrupt. They're often contradicting each other. I mean, the state of knowledge is chaotic, right? And so I think collective knowledge is actually the most robust. So that's why I say public. Because I want to put out there what I think I'm learning. Like, you know, I would be very happy tonight if there was a soil biologist in the audience and they said, wait a minute, let me argue with you on that. And maybe they would present something new to me. And maybe they would correct me in public. And maybe then you would have to decide, or maybe then you would go look it up yourself and pursue it, right? And because I'm really interested in people being involved with their own lives.
Hi, this is very exciting. You're talking about a lot of different things that I'm thinking about, currency and co-creation of knowledge and global value chains and all these things. I wanted to mention a few things since you made the invitation to share about, I wanted to talk for a sec about microbiomes because they're also something I'm very excited about, but also I have a question about abstraction. But about microbiomes, one thing, I've read about them in relation to cancer actually, and I don't know if this is something that you found in your research or in your experience with cancer, but that fasting can be an incredibly powerful way of fighting cancer, and also during chemotherapy. Apparently, this is just research that I've read about. Apparently during chemotherapy, if you fast beforehand, the side effects can be significantly decreased, and it has a lot to do with the microbiome. So I just thought it might be something you would be interested in.
No, that's
in
super
learning about.
interesting. I don't know about that. And so I'm really interested to learn that. I mean, there's so much that they're learning. I mean, there's like books and articles coming out like hand over fist now about this.
There's a very exciting project as well at MIT right now that was just launched about doing research in the sewage system and using that information to, perhaps foresee outbreaks in a city, also
wow.
related to the microbiome.
No, it opens a
Yeah.
whole new game. It's really fascinating to me. Yeah, thank you for those.
My question about abstraction.
Abstraction or extraction?
Abstraction.
Yeah, okay.
Is it's a big one, so you can answer however you like. But how do you have clear relationships in your work between abstraction of form or abstract form and then abstraction of everything else about? So you mentioned a place that you mentioned abstraction is in like creation of signs. You mentioned that in the creation of signs.
Signs.
Yeah,
yes.
you mentioned that in your talk, and I'm just wondering how does that? What do you think of when you think of abstraction, both in relation to form and then in relation to other ideas, that might not immediately be thought of as the form of your artwork?
Well, I do think about abstraction a lot because, one of the things that I like to do with friends of mine who are artists and writers is study infrastructure. And in fact, we have an infrastructure study group. And I also, last year I had a chance to go to Panama. I was invited to go to be kind of a artist in residence at a thing. And so we went through the canal and everything and went to some of the free trade zones where, so Panama is this amazing place where all these things come through, right? And it's this remarkable system. I won't go into it now, but it's very much driven by abstractions, by like logistics. Like logistics couldn't, on the scale that runs our life now, it couldn't have, it all depends on computers. It's all quantitative. And also, like, think about the financial markets. It is just crazy. Like their derivatives and, all this stuff that was born in Chicago where I live, in the Chicago Board of Trade. And I always take my students to the Board of Trade so they can see the guys in the pits with their hand signals, like buying and selling. And the pits are going. They're closing down because it's all on computer now. But it's really interesting to study the financial markets where it started as a way to organize very material things and to hedge against risks, especially for farmers, which is a very risky business, right? And it has turned into this highly abstract thing, right, of people making money off money. And then you think of algorithms, like how much of our life, I don't know if you consider that abstract, but I kind of consider that abstract. When you start running things by numbers, but it's almost a continuum to abstract something, right? Like there's, you can take something like, let's take abstract painting. I was trained as a painter. And, it started, like, you can see certain painters, like Broadway, Piet Mondrian, right, and his early work, and how the things that he's painting, trees, how they get more and more abstract, right? Which is more about kind of pursuing something that the human perceives as essential about the visible form, but that is no longer necessarily recognizable as deriving from this thing, right? So it's this whole continuum of like abstracting something, right? And there are things that can go back and forth. Like, take something like the flag. Like, that piece of mine has not shown in the US. I made that piece in something like 2006, and it just showed in England for the first time, although I've showed pictures of it and published pictures of it. But in the US, the flag, the thing itself, is so charged, like that every single, what do you call that, like a whole group of Congress, a phase, a generation, whatever. There's somebody brings up a proposal to make an amendment to the Constitution that you cannot desecrate this material thing, the flag. But why is that? Because of all the abstractions it represents, right? And that, you know, those people in Congress doing that, they want those abstractions to be intact and not complicated. I don't know if I'm answering your question at all, but you just got me thinking. Is that what you meant? No.
Yeah, the last one.
You've mostly answered my question, but there's one aspect of it that you haven't quite answered yet. All of your work, everything you presented here, as well as your methodology, seems to be very much moved by human agency. And so the last detail you didn't address is whether you see a role in your work or an interest in your work to bring in an element involving an absence of human agency. Asking it another way, do you ever go out and look at a forest and look for inspiration there rather than looking at science, research,
I see what you mean.
economy, infrastructure?
Yeah.
Do you ever think of bringing in elements to your work or your methodology that are independent from human agency?
I hear you. Definitely. I mean, I definitely go out into woods and to the ocean and to the rivers, and I love to observe. But I don't know how I could bring it in. I mean, that would be very interesting, you know, how to do that, because I am human agent, and I'm human agent Claire Pentecost, number 500,060 million trillion. So you're right, you know, that I do, and I use a lot of methodologies that have been taught to me by science. But like, for instance, this is still human agency, but, you know, like many years ago, I used to go out, I went caving and fly fishing, and I did these things to get me out into the ecosystems. And I would walk around, and me and my friends, and we'd have our books, and we like to name things, right? And then I felt really like I wanted a different relationship with nature than visual and naming. And so that's actually why I started caving and fly fishing. But I also spent like 2 years studying so-called primitive technologies, which are basically Aboriginal technologies, Stone Age technologies like bow making and bow drill to make fire and tanning hides, and still human agency, right? But I was hoping it would create another filter. Like, when I look at a particular kind of tree, I'm also thinking fiber, you know, and what's the consistency of that? Like, and how does it behave, you know, in a really kind of direct way? And So then I lived in the woods for like 6 weeks by myself. And it wasn't a survival thing. I had a lockbox, and I would walk in 2 miles into town and buy groceries and visit my friends. But it was really interesting because I wanted to learn all this stuff, right? And I'd been studying all these skills, and I thought, like, I'm really going to use them out there. I'm going to make headway. And number one, I found that those things are learned. Most of them are collectively done. And also, yeah, you don't do it alone. I mean, that's another fantasy. And that they take years and generations to learn. And the other thing was that I was like in a little laboratory of myself, of subjectivity. I mean, a lot of it was about how do I alter my mood when no one's gonna interrupt me. It was really interesting on that psychological level, or that subjective or affective level. And it was still human agency. So it's a very good question. I think Walter Di Maria, when he fills a room with soil and just lets the room make the form, is that trying to present something from the nature without so much human intervention? I just don't know if it's possible. I mean, if you have more thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them. Maybe not right this minute, but because I think they're going to kick us out, because that always happens in the United States. You can't just keep talking. Although, I've been in other countries where it's like, they just talk until everybody's peeled off, It's really funny. But we have the forms of time, too.
Wonderful. Oh, there is one hand in the end of the room. So we will violate the form of time for 5 minutes.
The monoform is Peter.
Thanks for the
remember
presentation and the conversation. I was very impressed by part of your ending, citing Said in representations of the intellectual, and it's kind of a double comment and question, perhaps. Perhaps you can expand a little bit more on this notion of the intellectual itself. It's not only the public amateur. At least he suggests that this is about the position of the intellectual as an amateur. But I would like to ask you, or maybe comment and ask you about the question of estrangement, the notion of defamiliarization, which appeared to be in some of your installations and projects, kind of at the core of what you could call the form itself. The ingots that are not gold, but they look like, but they are not, or the cages that are empty, but they are full of breasts. So in a certain way, there's a notion of the kind of the familiar becoming unfamiliar, certain Freudian uncanny at some level. And there's also at the same time, the idea that sort of the public that you're somehow creating with your work, is part of inviting awareness about all these specific issues that you're dealing with. Coupled with that, I think there's sort of underlying the notion of the artist as a collector, And many of the projects that you suggested, there's a series of collections, both of soils or materials that you use to fabricate or to present this work. So if you could perhaps expand on this connection between the intellectual, the collector, and this idea of the unfamiliar.
That's 3 questions at least.
Well, I'll try to make it.
Well, okay, the intellectual, I think Said's wants to refresh an idea of the person who pursues knowledge and understanding because like you said, not for a career or because it's part of the path that society has made for them, but that can reach through the boundaries that define our professions. And I think that doesn't have to be someone who thinks of themselves as an intellectual. because that word intimidates a lot of people. They think, I don't know what they think it means, but I think an intellectual is just somebody who likes to think and likes to talk about ideas and possibilities. Now, the familiar strange, the Russian constructivists had a word for that called astronanie. And that was a specific artistic strategy. And the photographers of the era of the revolutionary period used photography very much to make the mundane or the familiar strange. And it's interesting because it connects to the idea of astonishment, which some would say, actually, I was just reading this in Jose Muno's book, Cruising Utopia, about how astonishment is a position of seeing things beyond their familiarity, right? It's a form of attention. And, our attention, that is like a threatened thing. Like, everything out there wants your attention. It's like the most valuable thing about you. And so you have to kind of guard it and think about, where are you spending your attention? Anyway, so this making the familiar strange, I think, is always interesting. I'm the kind of person who likes psychedelic drugs, I like when things get strange. So that really interests me. And I'm also really interested in the uncanny. Not that I really produce that in my work, but, and I don't really think about that. But the collecting thing is not about that, I think. Or maybe it is, I don't know, you tell me. But one of the reasons I turned to collecting is partly because I'm so ambivalent about putting more stuff in the world. And if I can make installations from things that I have collected, I was ambivalent about just making those breasts out of, but I think there's a lot of pet coke in the world. This can't be the worst. At least it's bound by an epoxy. It's not gonna be in your lungs. And the things of the world are so interesting, and there's so many now. So you can collect, and there are a lot of artists that have really developed this artist as collector, like Mark Dion, for instance. And but I think, and that's Our Bodies, Our Soils, that is about comfort. That room it's so nostalgic, and it's partly because I wanted to. I wanted that idea of Darwin's house, this kind of idea of discovery in the mundane. Darwin was so fabulous because he was always doing little experiments around the house, in the yard, in the park with his children, and observing small things and how they work, and seeing them not as just something he already knows. Right? And that whole era of Victorian science that, in a nostalgic setup like that is, that era, I think, when it comes to soil, that's about where we are. We're just in the stage of taxonomy. It's such an underdeveloped field, really understanding this. But because we can't see it, it's taken a long time. Does that answer a little bit?
Well, perhaps on that note, we should end this evening and take further this question: how can we reconnect with? Take that question tomorrow in our discussion as we're meeting in the studio seminar in public art, public space, in the morning. And I would like to thank all our support staff and helpers, Amanda Moore, our cameraman, Marianne Cunningham, everyone at ACT, you, the audience, those who will be watching us on the camera, and of course our wonderful Claire Pentecost, bringing this fantastic discussion on the amateur.
Thank you.
On the amateur.
Thank you, Gediminas.